Hi, I'm Randy Tritell. I'm the Director of the Office of International Affairs of the Federal Trade Commission and the co-chair of the American Bar Association Section of Antitrust Law's International Task Force. And we're here today to begin the section's oral history project expanded to cover our international colleagues. And our guest today is Andreas Mundt, who is the president of Germany's competition agency, the Bundeskartellamt, and also chair of the International Competition Network. And what we want to cover today, Andreas, learn a little bit about you and your professional background, and hear something about the Bundeskartellamt and its relationship to the government in Germany and the Europeans and the United States, and to talk about the multilateral antitrust organizations, particularly the ICN, and to hear your thoughts on the international antitrust scene. So, why don't you get us started by telling a little about yourself and your professional background?
Yeah, Randy. Well, I studied law, first of all, because I did not really know what I wanted to do. And if you study law in Germany, that can take 8 to 10 years. So you can postpone a little bit the decision what you really want to do in the end until this age. So I studied law in Bonn and in Lausanne in Switzerland. And afterwards, I went to the Ministry of Economics. That was a very exciting time then, because that was right after reunification of the two parts of Germany back in 1990, 1991. And I was in charge of the law on giving back all these houses and what had been confiscated under the former socialist system. So I stayed in the with the ministry for something like 2 years. Then became not a member of parliament, but I worked for a fraction of parliament, the liberal fraction, for 8 years, and there I did labor law and social law. Very exciting time, much contact with members of parliament, with high-ranking senior people in the government, so very exciting time. And from there, I moved to the Federal Cartel Office, finally.
Well, what brought you there? It sounds like your background was in a totally different area. How did you find yourself going to
It was in a different area. Well, that had something to do with the move of the government from Bonn to Berlin. You know, by that time I had to stay in Bonn for some reasons, and I was looking for a way out because we could not move to Berlin as a family. So we looked for a way to stay in Bonn, and it happened that the Bundeskartellamt, which was located in Berlin by that time, moved from Berlin to Bonn in order to balance a little bit the loss of jobs that was in Bonn. Many agencies have been transformed to Bonn by that time. So I hired with the Federal Cartel Office and started anew from scratch at the age of 40, being a desk case handler in the Bundeskartellamt, not even able to sign my own papers, and I needed the allowance of my boss to do so. So that was hard at the age of 40.
Well, how did you find it getting into the competition field for the first time at that stage of your career?
That was an exciting time, and I would say at the beginning it was really hard because competition law is not easy, as you know. You really have to think into that world. But coming from German social law, German labor law, I can tell you that can even be harder than competition law. Maybe it was not that difficult. And there was always, of course, this affinity with regard to economics. You know, this is why I started my career at the Ministry of Economics. Stayed in there, if you want to put it this way, with labor law. For me, that is part of the economics as well. So it was a disruption, but it was not that sharp. So I worked for some almost 2 years as a case officer in the Bundeskartellamt. And then I switched to the General Policy Division and became head of international. And this is when we met first. That was back in 2001. And I was lucky enough to see how the ICN at that time was founded and how it has developed over time. And I myself was still thinking on some ideas if one could something else, because we were a bit afraid ICN might not work without a brick-and-mortar secretariat and all of this. So there was the idea in the agency we do it under the umbrella of the OECD or something. So I was really in the midst of it from the beginning. It was very interesting. So from there it went on to the General Policy Division, where I became head after 5 years. And then I was lucky to become the president of the Federal Cartel Office back in 2009. So these are the steps, how you get there.
Well, I'm guessing it involves something a little bit more than being lucky. And how is it that somebody who was once my counterpart as head of international affairs has become the president of the agency? Tell us a little bit about your career path in the Bundeskartellamt.
Well, I was handling international for, I think, 4 years, but at the same time, I also had responsibilities in the area of handling cases. We do that sometimes in the Federal Cartel Office. We have a two-way track. We are on the one side part of the General Policy Division, but still dealing with cases. And I had a special responsibility at the Federal Cartel Office with regard to financial transaction, credit cards, debit cards, and the regulation on that. And I was dealing with cases also during that time, which was quite exhaustive to be part of this international community on the one side and handling national cases with regard to this issue of debit cards and credit cards on the other side. And there we had a lot to do with the cases at the European Commission concerning Visa and MasterCard. And I myself prohibited a system in Germany that would have ended up with multilateral interchange fees between banks. They wanted to change a 3-party system into a 4-party system, and that was prohibited by me. That was one of my first deeds at the Federal Cartel Office, besides this work in international.
So how many marks or euro did you save your consumers?
We saved the consumers a lot of money, I think I can say, because I still remember all the essays I was reading by that time, many from the US, by the way, saying that these multilateral interchange fees between bank in this credit card issue were the hidden dynamo of wealth of banks, you see, and I remember that time, and it's still an issue in the European Commission, you know, there's still cases going on, there are cases going on at the Bundeskartellamt, so this seems to be this seems to be never-ending.
Well, was there anybody who was particularly influential in shaping your career, anybody who was a mentor, and how they may have affected your rise in the agency?
I think my predecessors at the Federal Cartel Office were both mentors for me. The first one was Ulf Böge, who was president at the Bundeskartellamt when I entered in the early 2000s. And then Bernhard Heitzer, who succeeded him, was clearly, from my point of view, a mentor as well. I learned very much from both of them. And you know, as I know, as head of international, you are pretty close to the head of the agency, because when they go around, when they go somewhere, when they move in this international scene, normally you're with them, and it is your task to build up that network internationally, and that helps the head of the agency a lot, so you can really do a lot for them. And I think this has helped a lot. So they definitely have both been mentors at that time. The final step to be the president, of course, also had something to do with the time at the Bundestag, when I worked with all these members of parliament, and in 2009 there was a new government installed, and the Liberal fraction was part of that government, and then it helped, of course, to know some people there.
So the different parts of your career came together.
That's it. It's not political. It was not political that I became the president, but the political connection, I would put it this way, it helps in such a situation. But without delivering a decent job at the Federal Cartel Office, the political connection alone wouldn't have made it, that is clear. So you really need to bring both things together, And well, it was a window of opportunities, and I was lucky in the end.
And how long is your term?
Yeah, my term is indefinite, it goes until pension age, which is still pretty far away. I'm 53, and we have to work in Germany until 67. We have a tradition of long-standing presidents in Germany. I'm only the 6th president of the Federal Cartel Office since 1958. So you see, all of them have been long-standing. I think the first one, Professor Günther, he has been in his place for 18 or 19 years. Mr. Carter, a very well-known president, also in the international scene. I think he has stayed for 18 years. So we have kind of a tradition that we have long-standing presidents. But it's not my perspective to stay forever. I just want to do a good job now, and then we'll see. And if it goes until pension age, all the better.
All the better for us. Tell us a little more about the Bundeskartellamt. You mentioned it was started in 1958. My impression is that that would be one of the earlier antitrust agencies established in Europe.
Exactly. It was hard to establish the Federal Cartel Office because 1958 was still the time right after the war, after World War II. And we had very fierce discussions in Germany if we should have a competition law or not. You know, by that time we had that famous Minister of Economics, Ludwig Erhard. He was very much in favor of such a competition law. We had Konrad Adenauer, who was the Chancellor, who was very skeptical. Mm-hmm. And we had a business association which was very skeptical about competition law as well. But from the experience we have made in Germany during World War II and during the time of the Nazis, I think there was an extremely precious and helpful step for Germany to turn to a competition system. Because Germany was known to be the country, the land of cartels under the Nazi regime. It's pretty easy to see that they try to steer the economy also a little bit by having these cartels in Germany. So the US made a lot of effort that Germany really took over this competition system as we have it today, and our system by that time, and the fact that we established a competition regime and a competition agency was very much inspired by the US. So a lot came together, the convictions of Ludwig Erhard, the US influence by that time. So it took a while until 1958, so you can see there has been a long-going discussion, but it took a good end finally. And then we were established, indeed, in 1958 in Berlin, and stayed there until 1999.
Right, but you say in Berlin, but that Berlin was not then the capital, is that right? So what is, and you mentioned earlier that there was a movement of the agency between Bonn and Berlin. So how does that work, and how does that relate to where the capital of Germany lies?
Yeah, that was a difficult time for many people in Germany. It's not easy to move a capital from one city to the other, and it's not easy on the other way to move a competition agency from one place to the other.
And why was it moved?
Well, it was moved, in fact, because when the government moved out of Bonn, there was a significant loss of jobs in Bonn, and the government wanted to balance that a little bit. So they took the decision to install many agencies that were spread around Germany to locate them in Bonn. And the Federal Cartel Office was one of these agencies located in Berlin. So it had to move from Berlin to Bonn, which was hard for the people who worked for the Bundeskartellamt, because they had been living in this divided city in Berlin, and now there was a real breakup in Berlin. You see, the government came, it was no longer divided, there was an enormous development in this city, and exactly at that time these people had to move to Bonn, you see. So that was a hard time. Some people from the Federal Cartel Office remained in Berlin and entered into the Ministry of Economics, which has just moved there. That was not an easy time in Bonn because we had very many new colleagues. I was one of them, not knowing very much about competition law. And there was a significant loss of people, of brain, of course, but I think we have managed very well with the people who came in from the ministries to do our job in a very, very decent manner.
But is it also a deliberate decision to have the agency located in a place other than the capital to demonstrate to symbolize the independence and the remove from the agency and show its independence?
Well, I would say, especially for the movement of the Bundeskartellamt, that was an important idea, to separate the seat of the government from the seat of the agency to improve its independence. It's difficult to say if it is necessary like that, but I go to Berlin very often, and what I see there is this political environment is a little bit a club. You know, you meet every evening here, there's an event here, people meet, they know each other very well. And personally, you are not really a member of that club because you're not always present. It's as simple as that. I don't know if that really helps to improve the independence, but it's not a bad idea. Let's put it this way. From this point of view, I'm pretty well connected in Berlin, but there's always a certain distance, and that certain distance can be very helpful when it comes to critical cases, when it comes to the question of political influence. So I would say it's not really a necessity, but it can help in a certain manner. And we are very happy to be in Bonn now, and I keep close contact with the political Berlin as president, and that's fair enough.
And how would you characterize the relationship between the Bundeskartellamt and the ministry? To what extent are they involved in the policies and decisions of your agency?
I would say we are really an independent agency that is already by nature, that is already in the decision-taking process that we have. Of course, I think no agency works in a framework that is free of politics. But politics have nothing to do with the everyday work, with the handling of the cases. That is strictly separated. What happens frequently is that we are called by the government or I myself in order to inform the people, or that we are called to Parliament to give information, to provide information, at what stage a case is. If we do a sector inquiry, there's always very much interest because our sector inquiries very often have an influence on legislation. There is much interest, but it never goes. It never goes to steering us in a certain direction or trying to take influence on a certain case. I think that in my 4 years now as a president, I haven't seen that. So I think we have an excellent relationship with regard to information, to transparency, to what happens in the agency. We keep people informed. We explain why we do what, which is very important, I guess. But there is no influence, no political influence when it comes to the decision-making process.
Mm-hmm. And tell us a bit about the decision-making process within your agency. My impression is that it's a somewhat unusual relationship between the role of the staff and the role of the president.
Yeah, it's unique, I would say. The Federal Cartel Office acts a little bit like a court. You know, we have what we call decision divisions, sectoral divisions, which are in charge of certain branches and sectors. And the decision in certain cases is taken by the head of that decision division, by the chairman, and 2 rapporteurs. And one of the rapporteurs is also the investigator in such a case. So that is a mix that you don't find anywhere in the world. I'm always wondering why this principle has never been copied, because it really secures independence from my point of view. So the decision is really taken in these units, in the decision divisions, and I, as a president, don't have a direct influence on these decisions. I cannot tell them what to do. They know better, and they know what to do. Of course, you keep informed. You try to give advice. Sometimes you get involved by discussions with the parties. That happens. Sometimes you act a little bit like a sparring partner with the decision division. So that's an important issue, that you're very well informed, that you have your own mind on the cases, and that you can discuss that with the decision division. That is very important for me.
But in the end, the decision staff decides how the case comes out, even if that's not what you would have done.
Yeah, but that has never ever happened so far. I think I can really say every decision that we have taken so far, I think it was the right decision. And if you really look behind the curtain, why a decision was taken in that way and what was the deliberation behind that decision, I really stood behind every decision that we have taken over the last years. So it never came to that. I think that is also due to the fact that it is the decision division who decides. But I think especially over the last 5 years, we have improved a lot in giving input into the decision division by everyone in my house who can give significant input and who can make the decision maybe better. That means especially that the decision divisions today consult with the litigation department more than they did before. They consult more with the economics department than they did before. So we really tried to feed in every knowledge that we have, every expertise that we have. We really try to feed in that in any case that we have, and I think that works pretty well.
So do you think that's because they try to read your mind and anticipate what you might wish, or you just have this process by which you wind up on the same wavelength? And
it's definitely that they read my mind and do what I wish. It's more that by making sure that you have so many instances in the house, so many units that can feed in their knowledge, you make sure by that that you come to a good decision. I would put it this way. And the fact that we have an excellent rate before court, by the way, proves that we do a very thorough and very decent work, I think.
Well, you mentioned that the economists have a role in this process. Tell us about how the role of the economists relates to the investigators and the lawyers, and if there's been any evolution of that relationship in the years that you've been there.
Yeah, there has been a very good relationship over years. I still remember the times when GCR, which does this ranking every year, they asked us who is our chief economist. And I remember that we never did that, but internally we said, well, we don't need a chief economist. Our chief is an economist. That was Mr. Berger and Mr. Heitzer by that time. But already Mr. Heitzer, my predecessor, has set up an economic unit in order to feed in knowledge into the decision divisions. And under my presidency, we have expanded this economic unit. Today we have 2 economic units. It's not only one. One is feeding in, economic thinking considerations into the decision divisions, where we have half lawyers, half economists, by the way. So there is already, by formalized manner, there is already a lot of economic expertise in the decision division, since many of the decision-making persons are economists. But of course, the world, with regard to economists, has become more complex, as you know. So today we have 2 units who feed in knowledge there. One is only on econometrics, is asked when we set up questionnaires, how we ask the correct question. When it comes to econometric investigation, that unit is involved. So that today that plays, from my point of view, that plays a very important role in the Federal Cartel Office, much more than it did maybe many years ago.
Well, I would say the reputation of the Bundeskartellamt at one point was of having a quite structural approach without a big influence of economic analysis. So in your view, has that evolved? Has that changed?
That is long past. That is, from my point of view, this is long past, and you don't hear that anymore in Germany, and you don't hear it anymore at the European level, I would say. Of course, we have a little bit we had a little bit of a structured approach, but that needs to be explained by our past. You know, after World War II, our competition regime was not only set up with regard to protection of the consumers and consumer welfare. A very important issue was to secure the freedom to compete. That is a very important political issue in Germany. It still is, after the experience we have made after World War II. You see, to secure this freedom of the economy is still an issue. So I think it came from that we are influenced not only by the consumer welfare side, but also by this freedom side. And I think this is where it came from. But I think over the years, if you look at our work today, we ask the same question, the same economic question as any agency around the world. Maybe sometimes we even ask better questions. We ask the same questions. We have similar results, and the procedure is very similar as well. So I think this is long day past and not an issue anymore.
Well, what would you say are some of the landmark cases or highlights of the enforcement regime of the Bundeskartellamt in the years that you've been there?
I think if you look at the past 5 years, we have continued our very vigorous cartel enforcement. And you can see that from the figures, of course, if you look at the proceedings initiated, if you look at the companies involved, if you look at the number of cases, you can see that cartel enforcement is at a very high standard in Germany, and that really we invest a lot of resources into that. You can also see that from the fines we have imposed. It was always, over the last 5 years, it was always around about 300 million euros, sometimes a little bit less. Although I must say I'm not so much interested in high fines. We are interested in well-working markets. But fines is always a landmark for the public debate, how active an agency is. For me, it does not tell very much about how much you do to improve the markets, but still it's a figure. And I think what we have invested there has really been a return on investment, because companies today take cartel enforcement in Germany really serious. You can see that by a lot of compliance programs that have been set up by companies, serious compliance programs. So this is one issue. The other one is, I think we have invested into the input of economics in the area of mergers, in the area of abuse cases. That's another pillar. And if you look at the last years, what is important to me is that we are very active with regard to developments in the internet. We have really looked at big cases there. We have had the Amazon cases on price parity clauses. We have had the hotel booking case on price parity clauses and all this. This is of an imminent interest for us, and it's very, very interesting too, because there you're on new grounds and new thinking, and that is very interesting. So I think these are the cases which have really been landmarks.
Mm-hmm. And what is the relationship between your enforcement and what goes on in Brussels?
It's I would say it's family-like. You know, it's we have to cooperate with Brussels. We have an extreme close relationship. We have an integration of agencies in Europe that is unique from my point of view. You know, in cartel cases we have parallel competencies. We have to come to an agreement. We have to come to an agreement on cases. Who is doing which case? We have a high security intranet, which means that I, from my office, can see on my screen which agency in Europe is dealing with which case, what is the phase the case is in, who is the case handler. So we have a unique perspective with regard to what is going on. And with regard to the European Commission, of course, we cooperate very closely, not only in cases, but we also have We have sectoral working groups on issues that are important. So I think that is really unique. Sometimes we quarrel, but not very often. In principle, it is an excellent relationship, and I think together we are really very strong.
Well, how do those quarrels get worked out? In mergers, I guess it's clear depending upon the size of the transaction, but in a dominance case or another case that has effects around Europe, how is it decided what will be done in Brussels, the member states, which member state will take the lead?
Well, the law says we have to look in cartel and abuse cases for the best placed authority. So we look a little bit, where is the focus of the case? Does it make sense to refer it to Brussels? The Google case, for example, was a case where we had complaints in many, many member states, complaints that went in the same direction. So from our point of view, it made a lot of sense that the European Commission was dealing with that case. We might have other cases, like, for example, the flour mills case, where we resolved this case by cooperation between various competition agencies. So that was a case that was brought up by Germany, by the Netherlands, and by France. So we cooperated and brought this case to a good end. But even in merger cases, normally it's clear where a case goes by the turnover thresholds, but there is the possibility of a referral of cases. And it can come to quarrel from time to time about important cases or cases that you have dealt with before with other companies in another manner. So that is never excluded. But normally we come together, we discuss it, and we come to a good solution. I mean, we are not agencies that only look at themselves and what is good for us. We mainly look at what is good for the markets and how should we deal also with regard to the companies. So normally we come to a good end with that.
Well, if it's a merger case that the Bundeskartellamt investigates, my impression is that you are usually, but not necessarily always, the final decision maker. What is the process for other involvement of the government in deciding merger cases?
Yeah, in Germany we have the possibility that in a merger case that we block on the grounds of competition, that we are overruled by the Ministry of Economics with regard to an overwhelming economic respect, you see. So the ministry does not really correct our decision. Our decision stands as it is, but the ministry can say competition in this particular case is less important than general economic deliberations. And this is how the government can overrule us. It happens very rarely.
Can you give us an example?
It happened. The last example, it happened in a case where we had blocked a hospital merger. And the government said that this merger should take place for ideas of concentrating the academic sector in the area of hospitals in a certain region. It was in East Germany. So it is accepted by the government that competition might be suffering from this, but there's another interest, in this case, to build up an academic medical cluster in a certain area of Germany. So these are deliberations, I would say they are of a structural policy nature and not so much of a competition nature. We believe this gives us a lot of freedom because we are an agency that in merger cases can decide solely on the grounds of competition. We don't have to take into account what happens with jobs, structural policy. That is not an issue for us, and from my point of view, it should not be an issue for us because we are competition people. We're not politicians. We're not doing structural policy in certain areas of Germany. So this clear division of work, you do the competition, the Ministry of Economics does the policy, takes a lot of political pressure from us. And by the way, this system has been copied by France. They have introduced a new merger system some years ago, and they followed that path, and they have copied it. And we are always asked at the OECD, don't you think that might harm your independence and so on? I say, no, it's the other way around. It secures our independence from political influence.
Well, then what would be your relationship with the courts? Do they have a role in determining your case outcomes?
Yeah, sure. I mean, courts play a very important role with regard to the outcome. You cannot switch the policy of an agency without the courts. You need them. And we learned how this is when we moved from Berlin to Bonn, because when the Federal Cartel Office was located in Berlin, it was the higher regional court in Berlin that was in charge of appeals against our decision. And when we moved to Bonn, it was all of a sudden the higher regional court in Düsseldorf. So there was a change of court, which also meant there was a change of judges. And the new judges, of course, they had never had anything or very much to do with competition law, so they started a little bit from scratch. How much they started from scratch you can also see from the fact that when we moved back in 2000 or 1999, there was one chamber in Düsseldorf that was in charge of appeals against our decisions. Today, they are 4. They're not only in charge for appeals against our decision, they also deal with decisions of the federal regulator in energy, the Federal Net Agency. But still, we give them a lot of work, you see. And they are highly experienced. We don't have a specialized court. Our cases go to the normal higher regional court, a civil court, but there we have specialized chambers. And this is a very good situation from my point of view, because these are people who have been involved in competition law for many years. So they know our thinking, they know our approach, and they are very deeply involved in competition law, and that helps a lot, of course, when you discuss these issues before court with the judges on the one side and with the lawyers of the companies on the other side.
And if a case is appealed to the courts, to what extent do they defer to the expertise of the Bundeskartellamt, either in finding facts or on your interpretation of the law or policy?
Well, with respect to cartel cases, for example, we have quite a unique system that personally reminds me very much of the US system, because in cartel cases, if we take a decision and the decision is appealed, our decision turns into a mere indictment, nothing else. And the Federal Cartel Office acts together with a public prosecutor before the court. But the court itself has to take his own new decision. So they hear every witness anew. Every document is feeded into this trial anew. You know, it's a very unique system, but it reminds me a little bit of the U.S. system, a court-like system, that we really have to go to court with a decision once we have taken it, and that we really have to fight for it. And that is a good justification also for the fact that in the decision divisions, the one who take the decision are partly identical with those who investigate the cases. That has always been criticized, but it has also been said that since we have such a tight and dense control by the court, once a decision has been appealed, it has been said that that is okay, that's supportable.
And is there much private litigation that follows on from your cases? What's the private antitrust litigation landscape? I know it's changing in Europe. How does that look in Germany today?
That has expanded enormously over the last year. That is due to an amendment of our law back in 2005, where we had a significant amendment to the law that facilitated private enforcement a lot. And if you look at the figures in Germany, I always hear that compared to the number of inhabitants and the gross domestic product, we have as much private litigation as in the US. So that has developed tremendously over time. Today, we see no bigger cartel case without follow-on actions. That is the rule today. That happens frequently. We are also involved in these cases. We can act as amicus curiae in these cases. We have the right to be heard in some of these cases. So there is a lot going on in this area that has really evolved tremendously over the last years.
Well, you mentioned cartel cases, and The cartel policies and enforcement in the U.S. and elsewhere have become increasingly influenced by policies on leniency. Tell us how the issue of leniency has developed and stands in Germany today.
Leniency is our most important instrument. Round about 50% of our cartel cases go back to leniency, so you can see that it is of an eminent interest for us, and that has helped us to evolve our cartel enforcement over the years the way we have done it. We have started with our leniency program back in 2000, but by then it was not very clear. Let's put it this way. It said we could grant leniency, but it was not clear for the parties what happens if I come in for leniency, how do they handle it, who gets full leniency, who gets a reduction, you know, all that was not really very clear. So that was one of my first deeds when I became, in 2005, head of international policy and head of general policy, to revise a leniency program and to set up a clear program, what is happening at what stage, and to give legal certainty to the parties who came in for leniency. And we can really say that since then, since 2003, 2005, the leniency program really works very well. But we don't rely completely on it. As I said, 50% comes from other sources. But from my point of view, it really works very well. And this is also the reason why we always fear that tension between private enforcement on the one side and protection of our leniency program on the other side. That is not an easy task in our system.
One sometimes hears about cultural issues in Europe or in Germany involving the notion of leniency. Is leniency very well accepted in Germany, or is that still a controversial concept?
It is still a controversial concept. And if you go into other areas of law, normally you have leniency programs also only for severe crimes, you know. That is a cultural issue, maybe, as you say. I always say that in the area of cartels, leniency is really justified, because very often a leniency program helps you to identify the one who has infringed the law. Leniency helps us to detect that there is an infringement at all. I mean, cartels are secret. You know, how do you unveil a cartel? And I think the leniency program is indispensable for our work, and this is why it's so justified. But in Germany, there's very often a discussion that the leniency applicant has gone out for free, benefiting from the cartel for many years, and then coming out free. That is an issue from time to time, sure.
Yeah. Let's shift to the multilateral area, and particularly the International Competition Network. You've seen that from the beginning, from its founding through its flourishing today, and with you as its chair. Tell us a little bit about your experience from the beginning with the ICN.
Well, I think at the beginning, we all were at least a little bit skeptical if that idea could work. To have an association, which is not a government association, but an association of independent agencies, a virtual organization connected only by email, by working groups, not really having a brick-and-mortar secretariat. So it is not easy to keep that together. And we have just been to a workshop here in Washington on due process and investigative techniques. And I think in this workshop were more participants than at the first annual conference of the full ICN in Naples many years ago. So you can see how much that has developed over time. The strength of the early ICN was, of course, that it was a very homogeneous group. It was mature agencies and young agencies, but altogether it was very homogeneous. And I think by that time it was maybe a little bit easier to come to an agreement in difficult questions. Look at the RPs on mergers that we have done. The recommended practices on mergers that we have set up at a very early stage. That was an extremely fruitful exercise, and I remember it wasn't an easy exercise.
Right, because so many of the members didn't have laws that complied themselves, and we had to persuade them to agree to standards that they didn't themselves meet.
That's it. Maybe it was a little bit the low-hanging fruit that we have picked by that time.
People say that, but it wasn't that low, was it?
No, it wasn't that low, but if you compare it to what we do today,
yeah.
If you compare it to how we try to achieve recommended practices, for example, in the area of unilateral conduct, where we have quite a divergent view throughout the world, and we still achieve that, you know. That is, for me, also a clear sign how well the ICN functions, and that despite the fact that we have grown into something like 130 members from 120 states, that we are still able, on the grounds of our common values, to go for these recommended practices and to develop into that. So nothing describes the development better, I think, from the first annual conference to what we do today when we have annual conference with 500 people showing up. That has really been a tremendous success.
Well, having recently become the chair, what are your thoughts about priorities and vision for the ICN? What would you like to see the ICN accomplish?
Well, first of all, let me say we should build on what we have, because we have an excellent fundament. There is no international organization in the area of competition which provides that knowledge, that encyclopedic knowledge like the ICN. So that is unique, and that is a very solid fundament. On the other hand, I already described the challenges a little bit. We are a very big group, 130 agencies, at a very different stage of development. We have young agencies, we have very mature agencies, and it is very difficult to get them all together under one hat, you see. The priorities of these agencies are so different, you know. The one might be interested in the question if we introduce behavioral economics into our assessment of mergers. The other one might have completely different problems. Countries who come from a system where you have many state-owned companies struggling with a very concentrated structure in many areas, their unilateral conduct might play a completely different role in other areas, and it is a very important feature. And to get all that under the same hat, to put the priorities right, what do we do, what do we tackle, where do we go, that has become very difficult. And to include everyone into this discussion is not easy as well, to keep everyone involved. And that is a little bit my focus as a chairman of the ICN, to focus us a little bit more in the ICN and really to try to find out what are the needs of our members and what should we do at what time. And that seems to be crucial for me.
That sounds like a daunting task.
Yeah, it is.
And Andreas, if we were to take out your crystal ball and look at the international antitrust scene 5 years, 10 years down the road, what can you imagine it looking like? Do you think we'll face a time when we would be looking at binding rules in an organization like the WTO, or are we going to continue down this soft law path through mechanisms like the ICN? What about the emergence of regimes in large emerging economies such as India and China? How are we going to hold this all together, and how do you see this going?
Yeah, that is going to be a difficult task. We work on this issue, as you know, at the OECD at that time to develop that further a little bit. I'm a bit skeptical about binding rules, I must say. when we started with the ICN and all these fora, there was still the idea of the World Competition Agency. I mean, that was an idea that which was very much favored in Germany. And we have seen that this kind of a top-down approach could never work. And it was for good reasons that we have to decided for a bottom-up approach, an approach of cooperation, of proliferation of competition regimes, of developing the same values, maybe identical strategies, of creating level playing fields. And I think this is still the key idea for the future as well. Because I don't see that we come to another development so far at the WTO or other fora. I think the approach is right. Our approach is right, and this is the path that we should follow. It's another question how to involve these big countries into our work, to attract them to our community and to get them in. And I think that is maybe the main challenge that lies ahead, that we get important countries into the community and that we cooperate with them on a basis that we cooperate between the Bundeskartellamt and the US DOJ, the US FTC, that we strive for that. I know how difficult this is. That is not the question. But I think this is the vision that we need, that we come together closer than we are today, and that we influence each other more than we do today. And I think this is the task for the future.
Well, that's great. And as we come to the close of our interview, Andreas, I just want to offer you the opportunity to make any closing comments or address any subjects that we haven't covered.
Well, what is most important for me, indeed, is international cooperation, because I think that is really crucial. Since you see there is no merger that has that is not going to be notified in many countries. Most cartels are not nationwide; they are international, and to develop that further on, for me, seems to be extremely important. Another issue is sometimes I fear a little bit that our world becomes more political. I don't say that with respect to the newest development. That is a general development, because competition between national economies has become so hard. You know, globalization has hit us all, and every country, maybe one day even competition agencies might act more in the interest of a national, or more in a national interest. That is something I fear sometimes, and I see that as my imminent task also of the ICN, to keep us free from this political influence, because I think that is one of the key values that we have, that we act on the ground of competition, that we are free from these political deliberation, from this political development. So I could say it easily, the independence of our agencies at a national level has to be uphealed to the international level, so that we as agencies as a whole, we remain independent in our cooperation, in the work we do together, and are not influenced too much by political influence that might come from other developments.
Well, I think we're all with you on that, and we thank you for the interview, Andreas, and we wish you a long, like your predecessors, and successful tenure at the Bundeskartellamt, and that you can realize your vision in the ICN, and that we continue our fruitful cooperation between the U.S. antitrust agencies, the DOJ and the FTC, on our matters, and that you have continued opportunities to collaborate with us in the ABA antitrust section. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Randy. Thanks a lot.